Good evening to all the listeners.
Now, Happy, developing countries, which obviously includes the African continent, growing increasingly angry at what they've called concerted attempts by high-emitting countries to block progress in Madrid. Give us an update of exactly what's going on the ground there and the fact that African countries are willing to take these negotiations until next year.
I think the first part is that we need to consider that this has been a long process where African countries have felt that many of the concerns that they've had around how the negotiations and how some of the declarations come out don't necessarily reflect what the African continent is really dealing with. So in terms of these particular negotiations, the African continent has put forward a motion which basically states that the African continent will be seen as a special circumstance, so that when there is any applicable kinds of finance, technology development, as well as capacity building, that Africa as a continent will then be prioritized because of its vulnerable status. So that kind of motion was not necessarily received well by the rest of the developing countries, but also by the developed countries, and then was pushed to the side. But at the same time, there's been discussions about the types of finance that is necessary for Africa to build its resilience and also to undertake the commitments that it has put forward, which are conditional on means of implementation.
Now, some of the big emitters have been accused, as pushing back and not wanting to play their part. Just what exactly are they willing to do, and how far are they willing to go with regards to accepting the emissions that they contribute to the global community?
So with the fact that we've got the Paris Agreement, what has happened is that the global north and the developed countries are starting to shift basically the onus and the responsibility to reduce historical emissions, including current emissions, to that of developing countries, because the idea is that developing countries don't necessarily have to build the same infrastructure and don't have to go through the same way of development as these developed countries have gone through. So essentially, what they have been starting to do is that the only commitment that there is for them to communicate what they're going to do and communicate what they will put forward as a pledge in terms of finance and technology. But the commitment itself to reduce the historical emissions, including taking up a greater portion of the current emissions, is no longer there. So that is something that is being shared across the whole globe, including with African countries, which at this current point in time cannot take the lion's share of those emissions, because that's not their historical responsibility.
Happy, one of the biggest issues, the fact that, politicians and CEOs are seemingly playing a game and making it look like they're doing or taking real action, whereas in true effect, there is really nothing that they're doing.
So, yeah, I mean, that is a key consideration, as well as a key criticism. Because at the international negotiations, countries, even in South Africa, sound as if they're climate champions, that they are making sure that actions are happening and that initiatives are actually being carried forward at home. But we know when we go back into our national circumstances and go back home, that the real issue is that implementation is not happening. So what has happened now, at least in the international negotiations, is that there is more of a voice to say you cannot say things and not do them at home, and you cannot walk the talk you cannot talk the talk without walking the talk. And essentially now there's a bigger cry from civil society, even inside, to say we're going to hold you accountable everywhere you go, including at the international negotiations. Do not lie to us, and make sure that when you go back home, you do what you say you're going to do.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called on the big powers and the big global players, especially the big emitters, to take responsibility and play their part. Do you think that his call will be heeded?
To be honest, no. Not at this point in time. What we've been waiting for as well is that the EU is going to share what they're going to do in 2050, which is a net zero trajectory of their economy, of their actual regional economy. We thought that we would get a new commitment from the United States, that they have rethought themselves to be back into the Paris Agreement. But actually what is happening now is that developing countries are now being forced to take the onus, as I said earlier. Developing countries are now supposed to basically take over whatever hot air has been left over from any other instrument that has been developed. And now the weight is sitting on developing countries to be able to implement and to make sure that we meet the Paris targets.
Happy, thank you so much for joining us this evening on The Globe. That is Happy Khambule, Green